that Professor Savas actually asked me to speak on. But let's look at this as a technological deterministic thing, shall we, for a moment? Emerging tech as a catalyst for business transformation, nothing else, just tech. And let's see how far that will take us during this talk without us begging the question of what else. So we'll cover in the first half a bit of background covering business transformation and what we termed ABCT technologies and is found in the literature in the paper we actually wrote. Then we'll shift our attention to patterns of innovation, which is mentioned starkly in the abstract of that Annals of Operation Research paper, and start thinking about the notion of not competing technologies, but coexistence of technologies and how they may inform business transformation. And then through case examples, identifying patterns of reuse towards things that we call enterprise architecture with the hope of reusability. And then just taking a different route for a moment with business transformation and challenging ourselves to think about new emergent business models that are coming forth, but also looking at evolutionary economic theory in the context of the theory of technical change. What does technical change propel, and what does that leave us with? In the latter part, I'd like to break our Q&A up into three. A response to the presentation where we open up the floor to comments and questions, then a reflection on what is actually happening today in business and what kinds of lessons can we take with us and reflect upon as we go forward. And then a special mention to the MBA students that I teach at the University of Wollongong who have just finished their session with me on Saturday, where we've spent the whole session looking at design thinking and business transformation. And I have been challenged by them to think about rethinking design, as well as many others. But should the focus really be on tech as a catalyst or on something else? And perhaps that something else is humanity. This is the paper. If you are interested in looking in more detail, Sharia Akhtar from the University of Wollongong, the Sydney Business School, and the research dean facilitated the end-to-end sort of conceptualization of the paper. Grace McCarthy added to the end-to-end. Mohammed Udin is responsible for the literature review and all the case examples that you'll see in the paper. And Raman also, together with him, tightened those tables. I've been influenced greatly by Dr. Roba Abbas on human-centered systems design. I had the joy of tutoring for her over the last 2 years as an honorary at UOW, part-time. And also this session, Associate Professor Belinda Gibbons, who just handed me her subject on design thinking and business transformation. And a shout out to the 30 brilliant managers in that MBA course who have really challenged me this session to think differently about business transformation. I put forward an assessment task to them on AI-enabled business transformation, and I thought they would come up with the typical case studies that you'll see in this paper. But in fact, all of the students and managers basically came up with things that I could never have conceived of. Everything from compliance as a service kind of auditing tools on greenwashing in the fashion industry, right through to looking at how AI would support patients during a process of going into a hospital. So we had some very varied presentations and group projects, but they really challenged me in the way I would incorporate humanity into design thinking into this process. A special mention also to Professor Asif Gill at the University of Technology, Sydney, at the School of Computing, for his recent injection into challenging me on reusability and enterprise architectures. So we begin with a bit of background, and really any company that's not innovating all the time continuously towards continuous improvement will fall by the wayside. And this great quote by Narayan, even though it's probably 10 years too late, is pity the enterprise whose fortunes are tied exclusively to the analog world, be it producing film, renting videos, retailing books, or selling packaged software. In fact, the new business model looks at new ways of interacting with customers, new business models that are really following new strategies, and also the notion that we are not really selling products anymore, but probably subscriptions. And this thing that you can't hold, you can't touch, but you can buy and be charged on a monthly basis, perhaps even a daily or a fractional basis. In our own paper, we use the term back in 2019 of digital business transformation as a strategy, whereby companies are challenged to continually improve their business processes and capabilities. And it stimulates new modes of working and interactions with customers, directly driving the creation of new business models. Now, I need to state this paper is old. It went into early access in 2019. It was published in 2022, but what's not old are those patterns of innovation and those implications we speak of, and also those ABCD technologies that we'll get to in a moment. But how has digital transformation become this new thing now of business transformation? What's the difference? And ServiceNow's CEO basically says, look, what's happened is digital transformation has really turned into business transformation. And he goes on to describe how companies are deflecting the pressure from their people, their employees, using digital technology by something that used to require 13 different applications and would drain about 33% of productivity, now being able to be offered through different seamless processes using digital transformative technologies. And he then says, let's look at the new game changers like generative AI and what will that do to our existing business processes. So this continual process of change, but this notion that digital transformation was a singular aspect, whereas business transformation changes everything in an organization. So a holistic approach rather than a singular digitization approach. Now, we do identify these ABCD technologies, and to be honest with you, we could say today, we could go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and probably say the whole alphabet. There are so many emerging technologies to choose from, but technologies like edge devices or the whole notion of edge is challenging the cloud. And so maybe edge is the modern way of thinking of things, but without, creating a spoiler here, possibly what we'll see is the cloud and the edge at one point, as they share a value chain, come together in terms of what their capabilities might be. The core might do something a bit different in the cloud to the edge at the hub or at the personal device level that one carries. But in essence, what we're going to see is an emergence and a blurring of a value chain. So are they really different, or are they really competing? A lot of commentary has been given today on how the cloud will be challenged by the edge and how people will flock to IoT and the edge and personalization on device close to the user and the proximity there. But the cloud will still do better things like software as a service, for instance. But without going too technical here, what we're seeing in these ABCD technologies is AI, software. Okay, if it is software and perhaps embedded in robotics. Blockchain is a process, a recording of transactions on a ledger. The cloud is really made up of hardware and networking components, and data analytics usually is about big data and visualization and dashboards and decision making. But I don't see people here at all. So if I was to challenge the paper that we co-wrote with the team of 5, I would say, where were the people? And we mentioned some of these things in the implications. So it's quite interesting at the moment when we look at these 4 technologies within the paper, we start to look at different aspects of AI or different implementations, whether it's machine learning and deep learning, and we offer case studies. Some of them are very short and snappy in tabular form. Others are sort of your insets like Affinity, Netflix, and Deep Instinct, we'll get to in a moment. But what we're trying to do is to sort of position the technologies. But what we haven't really spelled out, although we say the terms together in the cases, we don't actually acknowledge explicitly, and probably because we were novice at this while researching, that AI and the cloud and data analytics actually go hand in hand. Blockchain services can be found on the cloud when we're looking at banking and using the Swift existing system of interbanking. But all of these things are not standalone. You shouldn't really look at these technologies as one singular technology. They're meshed, they're in a complex environment, and they require one another to actually function today, or they sit on one another or are embedded in one another. So software in the cloud, software as a service, platforms as a service, and today, as we say, everything as a service. The same with big data analytics that could sit anywhere, but predominantly the cloud. So that's just a bit of an introduction on these new technologies, and despite the growing need for this digital transformation, 70% of projects fail with no return on investment. So while we have identified cases in the emergent landscape, which seem to be working in legal, in finance, in entertainment services, the list goes on, health, it doesn't mean they've all been very successful. But where they have gained traction, and we can talk about case studies of success, the question is whether we can reuse those patterns in future deployments. Will something that worked for Amazon also work for Microsoft and work for other entities, of course, dependent on the type of stakeholder they are? I just mentioned cloud providers now, but the question then becomes, can I reuse the cases of success across the board? And what might that look like? So we don't really want to be technologically deterministic here, because what's missing is the acknowledgement that systems are socio-technical systems. So when we look at the original Bostrom and Heenan interactive setting, we could see the social system and the technical system, and of course within an environment, but people are there, structures are there. It's not just technology and tasks. So no wonder we can point to those 70% of project failures when we can see that half of the system has probably been completely ignored by those adopting these ABCD technologies. In fact, in our paper, we hardly mention users. We hardly mention other stakeholders apart from the implications section. So that's a bit of a critique on what we discovered. So the other thing that we miss here is this notion of joint optimization, where we say, we can't just specifically look at the technical system and optimize the technical system in our organization in that specific instance of a digital transformation. We're saying we require both to be optimized together. It's not one or the other, or one more important than the other, or the users being everything and the technology not being everything. It's actually understanding these relationships as they affect one another together. And of course, I will not leave out there the environmental system. And here we have a progression of thought, and I'll show you different manifestations of the socio-technical theory and the new paradigms and the new pedagogies coming up. But whereas Bostrom and Heenan only looked at people, perhaps within work systems and employees, we're now moving towards a community notion, whether that's a community of employees, a community of people, a community of stakeholders, towards something called a community of practice, right? Your COPs. So how do we then think about relationships and social structures when we go from people to communities, and dare I say, nation states together? All the populace, all the industry, all the government agencies, all the entities. And we often talk about delineating between the micro, the meso, and the macro. And the micro, of course, from individual users in the community affected by the business transformation, to the meso, from the work systems internal to the organization and inter-organization and extra-organization, and the macro inclusive of national and international pressures identified by things like PESTLE analysis, which is a macro view of proceedings, versus your Porter's 5 forces, the internal to the organization, and then somewhere in between this top-down and bottom-up approach, informing our strategy and our alignment to the new landscape that we find ourselves in. Importantly, what we do find here is stakeholder engagement. And as we progress, something we spoke about deeply in our course was culture and goals. What is different in this particular mapping by Davis et al. In 2014 in the Applied Ergonomics Journal is that they identify the culture, the goals, the stakeholders, not just communities, but the word stakeholders is heavy laden, financial and economic circumstances, and these regulatory frameworks, which are akin to the environment subsystem, which hasn't been clearly identified in the past. We've just been talking socio and technical, but what about the environment and that subsystem? So we can see that there are more facets in this issue. And if we think that we're going to transform a business by looking at it from the before and after without transforming our culture at the same time, we're going to have a misalignment, a mismatch. And what companies try to do is to get ahead really quickly by adopting the latest technology without bringing their employees on board. And what you find there is an attrition rate that's very high, disgruntled and frustrated workers, and also customers for that matter, because the workers are frustrated. So when they call the call center, what you get is a difficult mismatch of alignment because people don't know how to respond and they're being put on the spot. So I guess going from the digital age to more your business transformation, we're looking at a more holistic approach to modernization. So you need to adopt a culture of continuous transformation. That's what it is, and allow your employees to come on board with you. Again, we can see the pressures on this particular socio-technical systems map, where we see the industry 4.0, potentially 5.0, the impacts on this socio-technical system, and therefore the hope that we can have joint optimization or some form of equilibrium there. On to the next section of the presentation. We have patterns of innovation, and you see here a butterfly. It's because we've been influenced this session at URW by the Biomimicry Institute and trying to understand patterns of flight, patterns of movement, patterns of tides, patterns of sunrises and sunsets. And understanding these patterns can help us to identify different kinds of patterns within business transformations. And case studies are a great example where we can go and identify some of these patterns. But the first thing that you do, as we did in this paper, is look for examples dating back from the time that we began the paper in 2017 to the time it was accepted and revised multiple times before 2022. And here, what we're doing is trying to clutch, and that's what we were doing, clutch at different kinds of examples of, in this instance, the ABCDs, but I'm presenting here the machine learning cases, the blockchain cases, and the cloud computing. And you can see a diverse context in different countries. You can also see a different specialization in different industry type and how these were adopted. For me, some of the more interesting ones are around legal services, for example, and financial services, and how some of these organizations use things like private clouds to ensure risk management practices were followed. But we can then delve deeper into seeing what kinds of ABCD technologies enabled different kinds of transformations. And in this particular instance, we look at how AI, big data analytics, and machine learning algorithms were used together in a call center to pair different kinds of callers to different types of respondents. So you can imagine in a typical system, it's a first in, first out service, a FIFO service. You call up as somebody who has an inquiry and you're met by the first agent that's available in the queue. Well, this does something a bit different. It looks at your call history, your patterns of engagement, and it says, right, we think you'd be best suited to person X, perhaps of the same gender, perhaps of another gender, perhaps of someone of the same cultural background, perhaps of someone you've had success with before multiple times, so you get to know the person very well. So you call up, and instead of a FIFO model, it's a model that matches you to your best match based on criteria. In another example here, we look at how Netflix operations uses machine learning in what's called nearline computations. It's not offline or real-time online, but this sort of in-between space, this liminal space. So we know that most of the recommendations offered by Netflix happen offline by going through massive Hadoop databases and churning through histories to provide evidence for a choice that may be proposed to you. But in this instance, throughout this complex process, what we see is some offline computation, some real-time online computation, and then some in-between near real-time computation. And what is occurring is that models are being created, they're being trained, and then brought together, and then you're given something as a recommendation and provided a user experience that we hope, or Netflix at least hopes, you'll like. This one to me, pretty much because we've just finished some major work with the Turing Institute, is of one of my favorites. It's the deep instinct using deep learning. And it's how AI is literally incorporated into cybersecurity to detect different anomalous patterns, either through different volumes of patterns, different traffic signals coming into the network, different simultaneous requests, perhaps pointing to a distributed denial of service attack. And what we find is that the system can learn and then defend itself based on predicted attacks. So it's quite clever, this blue team, red teaming kind of thing occurring in real time to protect and defend one's cybersecurity boundaries. But all of these things, as we delve deep to these case studies, we can identify in different ways. And the next 3 slides are dedicated to just ways that different scholars have talked about patterns of innovation, types of innovations, and sometimes they use the word invention rather than the whole innovation cycle. But let's look at the typical Henderson-Clark that was introduced to me by Dr. Robert Abbas some years ago. And this one talks about the incremental, the radical, sort of the divergent diagonals in that square, because it looks at components and architectures and the change in the components and architectures. And so whether something is an incremental change in a technology or it's a radical change going perhaps from a still landline phone to a mobile phone, or there's some kind of architectural improvement or modular improvement. For example, we could talk about longer lasting batteries or different features in an app and where they would sit on this quadrant. But we also have Joel Mokyr, for example, from 1996, talk about mutations and recombinations and hybridization. And I've been very inspired by this work because of my study in evolutionary economic theory. So this evolutionary modeling looks at, again, nature and creations and talks about mutations, which are variants on existing material. Most of the genetic material in every mutant is not new, so there's something that sort of is passed down. It talks about recombinations. Technological recombination is multi-parental, again, going back to nature, going back to creations. The opportunities for innovation through novel combinations of existing knowledge are a function of complexity and diversity of the economy. And then he talks about hybridization, where 2 or more artifacts are combined together rather than the information embedded in them. So there's 2 distinct artifacts that come together to offer a new innovation. In this work, I completed in 2003. I was looking at the automatic identification industry and identified patterns of migration, integration, convergence, and finally coexistence. And the biggest finding was not that one technology would overcome all the others, but in fact, they wouldn't only be integrated onto a singular card or a singular device, but they would coexist and not really compete. We can see that by taking out of our wallets a single card. It has our name, possibly our picture. It has a smart chip on there. It's contactless, may even have our fingerprints embedded. It might be embossed with a number and so forth. And what we find is this is an integrated card. So while we used to speak about migrating from barcodes to smart cards or from magnetic stripe cards to smart cards, in actual fact, now we're living in a society where a wireless device scans any type of card so long as it has a 2D barcode on it or some kind of symbology. So we can see these patterns occurring in technologies, and we could probably see these in business transformations as well. Going back to what the CEO of ServiceNow actually said, we're constantly converging at different levels. We can talk about convergence at the application level, at the technology level, at the product level, at the network level. There are many ways to describe convergence. So we can see these patterns in the case studies, and they should inform our practice. Recently, I had the pleasure of listening to the Digital Transformation Agency in Australia through the Digi network of Professor Asif Gill. And this was presented to us maybe a week and a bit ago on the reusability of patterns and the requirement to identify domains and capabilities and the importance of cases. Now, I'll stress today that cases are actually stories. They're stories of success. And we start at a domain level. We figure out what capabilities we might require. We build policies around this capability, and then we look at standards as a way to benchmark what's probably best in class towards designs, reusable patterns, reusable designs. So if I was to say to you the ABCD technologies, hey, they're good on their own and they're good in terms of application area, but what capabilities are we wishing to achieve by each of these? What kinds of reusable patterns can we create? Now, something to caveat here, businesses don't like reusable patterns so much unless it's reusable for their own organization. Companies are competing with one another, whereas governments want to know what their architectural decisions will be based on. So on the one hand, we've got governments saying, come on, let's lift the economic infrastructure up, and I'm talking about information here and knowledge sharing of success stories. And businesses out there, and small businesses and medium in particular, look at company A, B, and C and try to mimic what they're doing so that you're not left behind. So on the one hand, we've got government architectures being proposed and being pushed, if I could say that, as a positive thing. On the other hand, the competitive advantage mindset and profit maximization and sales maximization tells us that's my secret. I really don't want to pass it on. And the poor citizen is left thinking, well, here's another application for another technology, another device, and another service. When is this ever going to stop? Well, it's never going to stop unless we start to mobilize on some of these reusable patterns. Now, enterprise architecture, I won't delve too much deeper. Again, this is a slide out of the Digital Transformation Agency, freely available from architecture.digital.gov.au. But I was very enheartened to see that the individual experience mattered to the government agency, the government service delivery, the shared data and insights, again, sort of your analytics, the business reference, the technology reference models, the emerging architecture and agency capabilities. Now, you can imagine this kind of thing being done for the public interest. How could citizens mobilize around this kind of enterprise architecture to achieve their own goals? A quote here from the Unreal Engine Epic Games VP, Mark Pettit, who said, if we want a creator, and I'm going to have to look down, a creator economy, if we want our kids to have jobs that we could not even dream of ourselves, how do we think about those platforms as citizens, companies, and regulators? That's a really important point. He's talking about stakeholders. So he's not talking about businesses per se, companies is in there, but he also identified citizens first, regulators as part of the stakeholders we need to be thinking about. And I would add there this very rich ecosystem that has a diverse range of shareholders. Stakeholders, not shareholders, stakeholders. So he's saying if we want to go this way, how will we achieve that? Unless we think about these platforms from the eyes of these different entities. Finally, I'll look at evolutionary economic theory and how it has influenced much of what I've been talking about today. And forgive the slab, but it comes from Theory Hub, which is a Papagiannidis special. And Dr. Abbas and I spent quite a few months on this particular entry. But evolutionary economic theory views technical change as something other than an attempt to maximize profits and is characterized by the concepts of reproduction, variety, and selection. Again, going back to that evolutionary theory. Technological advancement is considered a key driver in evolutionary economic theory, co-evolving through the interaction of firms and industry structures and supporting governing institutions. It is also about the manner in which technological development can lead to assimilation as countries lagging behind the frontier attempt to catch up to achieve fundamental well-being for all, as opposed to being preoccupied with investments and human capital leading to accumulation. Now, many of you will say that's really nice, but the reality is Dick Nelson is an evolutionary economic theorist and was actually linked to the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at ASU, where I'm part of. He actually helped create the think tank with Professor Daniel Sarowitz, now retired in DC, a couple of blocks from the White House. But what he's talking about is we need to shift our understanding of why we are transforming. The hockey stick curve will burn out before too long. And the question is whether we are going to focus our attention on fundamental well-being. Very important to me is the emphasis on humanity that my students constantly remind me of. And I don't know if it's a phenomenon whereby in the workplace we find it difficult to speak up about important values that we all have. But I think there will be an assimilation between our hopes and the mental models that we all carry of what our hopes might be and the actualization of those hopes in practice. Because what I find consistently over the last 25 years of teaching is that students in the classroom will dream and hope about ways the world should be. But when it gets into practice, it's complex to actually advance those thoughts beyond what we can through social conversations. So with the evolutionary economic theory, a link there to my thesis of 2003. Please note, it was written when I was about 20. I did identify common ideas there. Selection environment. If we look at ABCD technologies, we can choose from any one of these technologies to implement. This notion of technological trajectory, often known as natural trajectory, or the pattern of innovation and the continuous improvement of products in terms of performance and reliability. Once you're on this path, what does that trajectory look like? Are we providing an avenue for thinking about where we will ultimately end up if we continue to follow this continual improvement and this continual transformation and this challenge to employees and individual citizens? In concept 3, I talk about another pattern. It's not a pattern at the individual product level or at the ABCD sort of transformation level. It's actually talking about patterns of systems of innovation. And here, after studying different innovation system types, I identified sort of 2 layers, those that were technologically bound and those that were geographically bound. So I can talk to you about patterns of technology innovation or sectoral innovation systems. And I could also talk to you on the geographic boundary of local, regional, and national, and perhaps one could argue international geographic boundaries now, as we've opened up borders with the internet and the great reach that we have. So what are systems of innovation? As identified by many theorists, among them Edquist and McKelvey, most of these individuals are sort of in your Northern Europe and beyond. A holistic and interdisciplinary approach that explains the process of innovation as a complex and dynamic phenomenon, explains how innovation comes about, and includes factors such as organizational, institutional, political, cultural, historical, cognitive, and economic determinants. But these are all patterns, and we can choose to see patterns of reuse at different levels of detail, the micro, the meso, and the macro. Perhaps one of my favorite all-time quotes is by Dr. Jerome Schwartz. This one comes from 1999, and he happened to be in an editorial of IEEE Robotics and Automation magazine. But I think Jerome's position really summarizes well what we're on about today. Not long ago, he says, I recall the heated debates about which technology was best, which would bring the most benefits, proved to be the most reliable or the cheapest. The implied question was, which will emerge as the real winner at the end of the day? I believe that competitive framework asked all the wrong questions and clouded a better understanding of how the technologies could exist side by side. And I would add to that, perhaps not side by side, but embedded one within the other. So our digital business transformation demands new business models. And for the time being, we have really focused on the competitive advantage story, as I said earlier, but governments are calling for different kinds of aims here towards well-being. So the notion of, do I go into this new project to increase revenues or save on costs? It's not that it's dying. It will always be there because we always need to make money, or we will always need to save on costs. But this notion of let's target profit and sales maximization, let's up the average revenue per user because we can double and triple it year on year, which we really can't, folks. But let's look at connection fees and rental fees and usage fees and interconnect fees and even content fees and any other fees we could drag out of that value chain that requires that service to run. We can say, let's invest in the product for this particular project with the biggest margin. I do remember in industry choosing between a 10% versus 55% margin. And of course, the sales team and business developers would always go for that 55% margin if they could in that given space and context. And so you'd use that for the bill of materials. And the aim perhaps was to reduce the payback period. I remember presenting in offices in Hong Kong where I was asked to go to the last slide after 2 slides and of a 25-slide presentation, and being told very quickly that my 25-year payback period was way too long and I had to slash that to 12. But even if I removed the capital expenditure, I couldn't slash that to 12. And even if I tripled the average revenue per user, I really couldn't get a payback period of that time. So this constant pressure for more, for less time, I think is a model that won't be sustainable. In the same token, once we've deployed and saturated the market with all this technology, the customer is not going to buy more bandwidth. The customer is not going to be buying more storage. They could go to the cloud and get that at a scalable level. So what do? You start selling on cost savings. And once an oversupply of a given product is achieved, then what? You sell solutions to optimize. I'm coming in to help you to optimize, and I'll do that in a way to help you. I'll increase productivity. I'll use your existing infrastructure and give you more, value-added services that you can sell. Perhaps I can come in and do professional services or some other limited value proposition. But that is really the old school of thinking, though it has sustained us to date. If we are talking about things of well-being, possibly we are talking about things to do with the public interest. What does society need? How to ensure the maximum value product or valuable product rather than the minimum viable product, and what kind of public interest technology can be considered in terms of the ABCD for the people, so they can harness the power of ABCD, EFG, HI, whatever, and new business models that would allow for co-design to occur where stakeholders are empowered and share in co-leadership and share in the co-design of processes that are important for them. So regulatory compliance can be one of those new business models, though it's been around for a while. It's intermittent and really periodic and sometimes not even enforceable by penalty. It's contentious when we're talking about emerging technology, but it is there. Regulation can enforce business transformation, but for the greater part, what we need is new models going towards what's being called and touted public interest technology. To conclude here, the last 2 slides, the lessons learned from this exploration, not only identified in the paper itself, but post the paper with work I have done with Dr. Robert Abbas, is that business transformations should be seen as socio-technical interventions. Yes, technical change is a catalyst for economic change, for sure, but we're seeking new models and new modes. Digital transformation technologies are isolated endeavors. They usually fail, or they're singular, they're once-off. And we hope that, how many once-offs can we do unless we're thinking holistically in a business? Business transformation demands the involvement of stakeholders and multiple stakeholders, forming a community of practice, not they said this, I said this, and there not being any cohesion or any congruence or any agreement. All of these CO terms, connection, collaboration, co-design, consideration, communication, these are all positive practice terms that bring people together. Evolutionary economics stresses co-evolution at multiple levels, the meso, the macro, and the micro, within systems of innovation as identified in patterns. And as we said, not a singular technological breakthrough, but this A-intertwined B-meshed C-D, where we can see these coming together to offer new services that will truly transform businesses. And it is diverse patterns of innovation that take place together with organizational cultural change at the heart of success. One of the students in the MBA course, Rain Azer, came to us in the first week or the second live week and said, look at this model where culture is at the base of the pyramid for business transformation. And we all studied it together and agreed. But you see this coming up in the literature now and in those emergent socio-technical design paradigms and new pedagogies. The patterns of reuse can lead to capability development, standards, and standards are now called soft law in some spaces. they're technical, they can be mimicked, they can be used as blueprints, and we can find ourselves with enterprise architecture, reusable design patterns. And the goal, as my class has so beautifully put together this session, is to look at these global ideals, these UN Sustainable Development Goals that point us into a direction. So we can't, on the one hand, be talking about a business doing X, even if it's embedded in their vision and mission statement, and in practice doing something different. But we need to mobilize around goals and actually track back to these. And one way to understand these are the PESTLE analysis that look at the different types of politics, ethics, environmental issues, social and technical and legal. So with 4 items for a takeaway today, I think it is that we need to be driven more not by technology, but humanity-centered ideals. People are at the heart of change, all stakeholders thinking longer term. These are also things that the great Don Norman speaks about. Community design is really important, forming communities of practice at the grassroots to enact change. This notion of public interest technology, new models must be proposed to be considered, better goal-directed projects that do align with existing challenges of the nation state, but also those international UNSDGs. And the notion that transdisciplinarity is important, where government agencies start to work closer with businesses, academia, and the third sector across disciplinary boundaries where new innovations can sprout up. So in a nutshell, that is the presentation, and I'd like to open up the floor for responses to the presentation, comments, or questions.